Good evening and welcome to the special meeting of the Glendale Water and Power Commission on January 14, 2014. May we have roll call, please?
Before I begin with roll call, for the record, Commissioner Chan will not be attending tonight's meeting. Commissioner Camargo?
Here.
President Yao?
Present.
Commissioner Jemian? Commissioner Hale?
Here.
Next item, please.
2 consent items. A, approval of the November 4th, 2013 meeting minutes.
Are there any updates or changes to the November minutes? If there's none, then the minutes considered approved. Next item, please.
3, GWP Commission/staff comments.
Any comments or announcements? No? Then let's move right through. Next, please.
4, report informations. A, water rates update.
Mr. Zong.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, in your packet, well, let's go back. Before the holiday season, I sent you all a letter that went over some of the issues we were facing with regards to our water rates that were enacted years ago, or 2.5 years ago now, and some of the issues that we found with those rates. And as a result of that, we were going to proceed with some further action, mainly having a complete new cost of service analysis done. And the other action, let me back up, I also believe I included a council agenda item, because the council heard this at their final meeting of the 2013 year. And the other issue was to ask council, because really we found, and I'm dancing around because I'm going to have Doreen Martirosian come up and give you the details on that, and she worked diligently on this. Essentially, we found errors in the way the original cost of service analysis and rate structure was set up by the consultant we used at the time, Wilden. In addition to what we think the fundamental problem was, which was billing on making calculations based on a monthly basis versus the bi-monthly billing cycle that we have, there was also issues with the fire line charges. Some of you commissioners who were here, I think Commissioner Yao, remember that was a very controversial issue at the time. So one of the actions we asked of the council, not only to proceed with the COSA, the evaluation of the rate structure and the new COSA development, but also to, effective January 1st, suspend the fire line rates until we have completed that process, and then we would return to council and make our recommendations and seek further council direction on where we needed to go. The biggest issue we're dealing with here is our revenues were not meeting our projections to the tune of about $8 million, substantial. So our first objective is to complete the COSA, get us back on track with the tiering structure and the billing structure that's necessary to, or that we had intended, I should say, to have in place back when the rates were first approved in 2011. So that was our initial objective. Council gave us the approval to go forward with that. Since that time, we have been working with the new consultant, Bartle and Wells, to complete that COSA. We have a schedule, a tentative schedule, which I'll let Doreen go through with you, and then we can answer any questions you might have.
Maybe I just have a quick background on that perspective. As I recall, doing the consultant study, Wildan, they did a cost of service model where they have it in place where the city can change the rate structure and maybe add certain things that maybe have misplaced or not accounted for. Can that model be used to accommodate the new rate structure?
Okay, let me see if you're saying the original cost of service analysis? If
right.
That could
Did
be,
they build a model to accommodate the cost of service where inputs and assumptions can be updated and modified according to what the cost of service could be?
Originally, Mr. Yao, what our intention was is we thought there was enough salvageable material in the original cost of service analysis that we could just make revisions to that. There's still a lot of valid information that we can use, but the fact of the matter remains we're effectively having to go through the entire cost of service analysis and at a minimum to review it and put the quality assurance and quality control to it to ensure that it's valid. So this is it's not quite the expedited process we had hoped. And in essence, we're putting together a new cost of service analysis.
That's it was confusing to me because when we hired Rodan initially, we thought they were doing a great job, and the people who were involved with the process were at the higher level to walk them through what is needed for the city. And so pretty much it sounds like we're throwing away that model and all the assumptions that went with it for a new study. But I wasn't sure if what they did can be incorporated and make it maybe more expedient or maybe less expensive for the new consultants to fine-tune?
To the extent we can, Mr. Yao. But to go back to what the comment you made about we thought this was a great study done by a quality company. I'm not casting disparaging remarks at the company, but this was fraught with errors. Had contained many significant mistakes that has now cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million.
So that goes to the next point, because I think you guys discussed it with City Council on the remedy for that. Was there any type of action we can take on the consultant? Or?
Well, and I'll let Christine and/or Doreen talk about this to the extent they can, but we are exploring every option, legal and otherwise, to seek some sort of remedy for this particular situation. But a lot of that we are unable to talk about here, but believe me, we are not leaving anything on the table.
Okay, I guess we'll hear more about this and we can have further.
We absolutely will, and this is really just a briefing based on what we provided to council. But we will be back to you following the proper process, which includes going back through the Proposition 218 process. We have built in a review with the commission to make that final recommendation to council, as we do with all of our rate scenarios. So yeah, we will be back to you.
Maybe another question. This is just forgive me my not understanding the model and what took place with Rodan. But I thought that like I mentioned before, if the model can be updated, if there's like an $8 million gap, couldn't that be accommodated in the model where something's missing? You can just add that portion back into the rates and then continue on?
Well, Mr. Yao, we're going to fix where the mistakes were made. But the $8 million at this point, there's one of the potential options is that we go back and put some sort of adder or surcharge on to get that back from our customers. That's a decision council ultimately will make. Or we have to look at the future and future rate increases to recoup those monies. What we're attempting to do now is just to get the rate structure in place today, after our third rate increase went into effect, 3 of 4 went into effect on January 1st, to get it back into place as soon as we can, which is going to be close to mid-year this year, of what we originally intended to do back in 2011. The whole issue of recouping the lost monies, that takes on that's a different discussion of whether we want to go back retroactively to get it from our customers, or we want to extend out into the future rate increases beyond the 4 years that the council originally approved to try and recoup those monies. Those are all discussions and options that will be placed before the council, and it will ultimately be their decision.
And what about the gap? How does that impact the operation or capital investment because of this $8 million gap? It significantly changes what our financial forecast was when the original structure was put in place. We won't be able to close the deficit gap that we had, as you recall, we had a $21 million, estimated $21 million gap. And at the end of the 4-year period, we were able to close that gap. We were able to put into place in years 4 and 5 a pay-go capital system
That will likely, under this scenario, if we were to do nothing in regards to trying to recoup the $8 million, those capital programs would probably be not, we would not be able to pursue those once the bond proceeds were expended.
Any other questions or comments from the commission about that? So you mentioned that Doreen will...
I probably stole most of her thunder, but I would welcome her to come up and fill in where I may have missed.
Thank you. President Yao, Commission members, good evening. Doreen Martirosian, Assistant City Attorney. I just wanted to give you a brief summary of what has happened, where we are now, and what next steps will be taken with regards to the water rates. As Mr. Zern indicated, if you recall, back in April of 2012, Council adopted the new water rates, which was a restructured water rate system and a water rate increase. In order to get to where we were in April of 2012, the city hired Wildan Financial Services, and they were the consultants that assisted the city with the restructuring and the water rate increase. As GWP staff was monitoring the GWP water accounts, as they regularly do, they noticed that there was a revenue shortfall. And they started doing further research and investigation. And in 2013, they figured out that the revenue shortfall was due to a probable miscalculation in the water rates and the tiered rates that Wildan had put together for the city. Further research, and of course, when we were doing our research, we had to confirm this with Wildan, which we ultimately did. Staff discovered that basically, in essence, what Wildan had done for the tiered residential and multifamily rates was they had taken the bi-monthly consumption data and they had entered it as monthly consumption data. So instead of the city sends out bills every 2 months, instead of, hypothetically speaking, this is just a hypothetical number, instead of using the 30 HCF, which is bi-monthly, they use that as a monthly consumption data. The city contacted Wildan back and forth, and they finally confirmed that that was indeed what they had done. And as Mr. Zone indicated, there was a revenue shortfall. The utility was under-collecting from the tiered rates, and the shortfall is going to continue to grow until the rates are corrected. While staff was investigating the tiered residential and multifamily rates, staff also discovered that the fire line charges for fire lines 4 inches and greater in size, and I'll explain why it's fire lines 4 inches and greater in size, they exceeded the proportional cost of service. The fire lines 2 inches and 3 inches in size were inadvertently left out by Wildan from the new rate structure, so the rates were never increased for the 2-inch and 3-inch fire lines. And in essence, again, very briefly, the reason for the excessive charges in fire lines for 4 inches and greater in size was the methodology used by Wildan. What Wildan did is they included cost components beyond the ones necessary to maintain private fire lines. By way of example, they included components that are necessary to maintain public fire lines or public fire service, and added the private fire lines to the public fire service components as well. So what has been done so far is we went to City Council on December 17th of 2013, and City Council was notified of the situation, and City Council opted or chose to suspend the fire line charges for fire lines 4 inches or greater in size until we are able to work with Bartle and Wells and come up with an accurate and correct rate structure, water rate structure. Again, the fire line meters that are 2 inches and 3 inches, they are not being suspended since they were not included in the new rate design. But the next steps that GWP is intending on taking is our goal is to have a COSA completed and have it brought back to the City Council. Our goal is to have the COSA completed, the cost of service analysis, by the end of February so that staff can vet it, we can go through it, we can make sure that everything's accurate, everything's working properly, and our goal is to return to council in mid-March. When we return to council, we will give council a full report, and at that time, we will ask council for authorization to issue the Proposition 218. Once that notice is issued under Proposition 218, once we issue the notice, we have to give at least a 45-day hearing period, a pre-hearing period. During that period, we will be holding community meetings, many community meetings, so that everyone has an opportunity to come ask questions, gain knowledge, get educated on what has gone on and what is expected in the near future. Our goal to return to council with an ordinance for introduction, for consideration and introduction, is in mid-May. We're looking at hopefully May 13th would be the introduction, and if council is inclined to introduce the ordinance, then May 20th would hopefully be adoption. There's a 30-day mandatory waiting period before the ordinance goes into effect. So we would hope that if all goes well, the new water rates would be effective July 1st of 2014. As Mr. Zorn indicated, the City Attorney's Office is refining all of the city's legal options against Wildan. Unfortunately, because we're in that process, I cannot elaborate more on what those options will be or may entail. With that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Yao, members of the commission, just to add to that schedule, so for your, so you have that, May 5th is the date that we have tentatively scheduled to come back to the commission. So in that whole process that Doreen was just explaining, May 5th is that date. I'd like to be back to you with what it is that we are going to proceed to council with your comments and recommendations.
I just have one question about Wildan, because you mentioned that the staff went back to Wildan to clarify what they did. Usually consultants like that, if there's an error or mistake, I'm not like for or against Wildan, I'm just trying to understand the process. Couldn't they be the one who correct the issue rather than pay another consultant to do the study? I mean, I know there's probably lots of trust and the integrity of the process has been broken, but I wasn't sure what was behind that.
Well, without elaborating too much, because it does overlap into the legal issues there, I think you kind of answered that question in just, where we were and the answers that we received back from Wildan and their legal counsel. And our level of confidence, we decided to go in a different direction.
That seems fair. Any other questions or comments? So one last thing, how do we ensure that this new consultant and the new process will be more accurate and reflects the cost of service?
That is a good question. As we went back and dissected what occurred with the previous process, and it's been a little bit difficult because all of the players that were involved are not here. I'm new, Mr. Blake's new, so we had to kind of fill in the gaps ourselves in some of those cases. But we've put in place a quality assurance, quality control, and vetting process that we used very effectively for the electric rates, that we don't believe was used, at least this extensive of a process, used originally when we did this. But because of the importance of any rate increase, we put into effect what I think was a very solid review process for the electric rates, and we're very happy. The city auditor's office ultimately is the one who signs off on that, but it also includes the IS department, it includes the finance department, and it includes our own GWP staff. So working collaboratively together, they go through and pretty much kick the tires as thoroughly as you can. And we were very happy with the results of the electric rate QA/QC process, and received a very favorable response from our city auditor. And that's the same process we're going through. And we hope that will alleviate any future problems we may have with our rate structures.
Yes, thank you for that question, one of mine. But I think you've covered it in terms of what we've learned from that last experience that we can apply to future. So for that. Question is about for this commission and our role. I heard you say that you'll have during there by February, end of February, you'll have the new cost of service analysis. So, sorry?
We're hopeful, yes.
Okay.
And we'll have it vetted. That's our goal.
So then, I just wonder if there's an interim step. Mr. Zern, you said that we would see the, what would it be, the draft ordinance that we would see on May 5th? What exactly would we see on May 5th?
You essentially will see the options, if in fact there are options, we anticipate there will be. We'll have a staff recommendation, and then look for what your recommendation, the final recommendation to the council would be on going forward. And that likely may include extending the current rate structure out in order to look at recapturing the lost revenues that we've experienced.
Okay. So I guess I would just, maybe it's more of a question to ask, is there an opportunity for this body to take a look at some of the preliminary thinking in that early March time frame, given that we have, a meeting planned March 3rd, before it gets too fully baked?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we've struggled with a little bit, because not only do we have the COSA, then we have to go for the Prop 218 notice, but the Prop 218 notice has to have the proposed rate schedule included in it. And without council's buy-in, then there's no sense in us putting that notice out in the first place. But we'll take a look. We'll take a look and see if there's an opportunity to come back. I want to make sure that we've got everything in a final form, that it's going to be the very same thing we show the council. So if it isn't ready, then we won't be able to bring that to you. But as Doreen said, we're very, very hopeful. This consultant has been extremely responsive. Staff is as you can imagine, very invested in this, and this is a high priority, if not the highest priority for the utility. So let me take a look at that and see if there is an opportunity to put it in an earlier meeting. So maybe it's more of a presentation of the COSA to you if we have it complete before we bring it to the council.
Okay.
Let's see if we can try to do that.
And then one additional question. So with respect to, lessons learned, I guess the other thing to think about, perhaps it's easy for me since I was not on this commission at that time, but, is there more that this commission can be doing on the quality assurance side? And I know it's quite a bit of detail to get into, but I would just ask as an open-ended question, is there an opportunity for this commission to do more in the spirit of quality assurance?
And that's a good question. It all comes down to process, and process that I think is incumbent upon the staff and the consultants to bring forward. But I think in your position, it's which question is the right one. You were presented very positively, I'm sure. I wasn't at the commission meeting, but I'm sure, and Mr. Yao indicated, a reputable consulting firm with full support of staff. I think it's sometimes difficult for you in your position, I would think, would be if I was there, to start to begin to question methodology and the quality. That should have all been vetted and solid before it ever got to you. And that's what we're going to make sure it is before we bring it to you again. But, the line of questioning that the commission has, I think my sense is it's difficult to say to you, you should ask this question or that question, because the answer you're going to get is favorable and the presentation positive, because everybody felt that they had the answer and that this was the right way to go. And it wasn't, unfortunately.
Well, just to provide some further background, we had a committee to choose the consultant back then. So we had like 5 or 6 consultants, and 2 members of this commission were on that selection committee. And then I was one of the members, and we picked, the presentations were all great, and Wildine stood out because they were one of the better consultants. And so they were selected. But after that, we don't know. Staff takes over, and then they work with a consultant to fine-tune the model and come up with the assumptions and methodology. So I'm not sure Commissioner Carmichael's questioning might be this commission or a member or 2 could be involved with that process as well to understand what goes into assumptions and maybe suggest some assumptions. I wouldn't go there either, but is that what you're talking about, Commissioner Carmichael?
I'm not sure where that falls in commission responsibility. I'll leave it to Christine. But, at some point, as you recommend things to the council and to the city manager, it's incumbent upon the staff to take up the work. Certainly the questions you ask us, if we have to go back and do some further analysis to bring those answers to you, that's fine. But I'm not sure, as we go through the process that we, I don't see, for instance, in the process we're going through now, a role that the commission could play. This COSA is being undertaken through the attorney's office. That's where the impetus of this is coming from because of the situation we're in. So it even becomes a little bit more sheltered in that regard.
And I think it would be difficult to fit that within your powers and duties under the code. Generally, your role is to advise the city manager and the city council of policies. So it'd be hard to fit it in. It's something we could explore and think about.
No, I don't think we need to. I mean, I agree that we don't need to go through that process, but having the input in the initial selection of Wildan initially, I think that was an appropriate process because we get to provide our perspective and saying, okay, these are the people that should be filtered and screened and selected. So this commission, I think, was appropriate from that perspective. But we don't want to interfere with the operation and trying to come up with a new model or the assumption that goes into it. So even though we didn't get that perspective, I mean, it's unfortunate that this model and this consultant didn't work out. But I think in the future, I think that process should continue where the selection of certain consultants could be vetted through this commission with one or two members to be on that panel. So even though that process of selecting a new consultant didn't pan out that way, I think staff just select somebody, right, the new consultant, rather than going through a bidding process.
No, it was vetted, as I said, through the city attorney's office, and Doreen handled that, and she did take multiple. Well, she took she took 3, I believe, proposals. But again, because of the sensitive nature of the situation we're going through, we had this handled from the city attorney's office.
No problem. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
With regard to the new consultant, Bartle Wells, I'm just wondering if we have specific legal remedies in place in the contract that would address this situation if they fail to perform their duty as the previous contractor did.
I'm certain that we do. We have very thorough contracts, so I'm certain that we do.
Any other comments? I have a speaker card. I'm not sure, Mr. Zavos, you mentioned item 3, which is, I'm sorry. Did you want to talk about this item? Yes. Okay, so I assume that. So go ahead, I'll change it to item 4A on your card.
And before I begin, is there a report in connection with this written report?
No, there was just a memo from Mr. Zone to the city council members and the commission that was dated December 12th. That's the only memo.
That was specifically to the commission members.
Council, Commissioners, my name is Harry Zavos.
Mr. Zavos, hold his time, but just this went to the city council. There was a council agenda report.
Yes, I saw that.
Okay.
There's an irony here. I heard lessons learned. The irony is this, that before this ordinance was passed, I did a full analysis of the Wilden report, pointed out several errors in that report that violated Proposition 218, and supplied it to the city. The Board of Realtors went to a law firm in Pasadena that was one of the lawyers in a key case on Prop 218 called City of Palmdale versus Palmdale Water District. They had a copy of my analysis. They went through the Wilden report, and they agreed there were several 218 errors. They produced a letter to that effect that was shared with the city before they passed that ordinance. So this should not come as a surprise. All of those warnings, all of those laying out of errors in the Wilden report were ignored. And I am certain that we wouldn't be in here if one of those errors didn't result in a shortfall. So I think lessons learned is to listen to the public, particularly when they take the energy and effort to do an analysis. I hope those analyses will be made available to you and to the new consultant. And I would hope that there would be some input and some listening to the public when they do this. For the life of me, I don't understand how the city could have those errors laid out for them, how they could have a law firm that has expertise in this area indicate there were errors in that analysis, which violated 218, and to proceed without even bothering to explore those or to listen to them or to talk them through. Now, in addition to that, Wilden did another report for the city. And in that report, they came up with a model that reallocated the joint costs between the water and the electrical utility. And they did it in such a way that $2 million more was placed upon water and $2 million was freed up from electrical. And that $2 million increased the transfer from the utility to the general fund. Originally, it was slated to be $19 million, and as soon as Wildham's analysis did the reallocation, so that $2 million more was being assumed by the water utility and freeing up $2 million in the electrical utility, that transfer jumped from $19 million to $21 million. Now, I did an analysis on that and did analysis on other ways in which the utility is subsidizing general services, which was fairly ignored. I got a response from the city attorney. Many of the answers were non-responsive. I actually met with Mr. Ochoa before this ordinance was passed, went through at least one dramatic instance of how you couldn't trust the Wildham figures, and I would be glad to talk about them if you want to ask me about it, and they were ignored. I would hope that that model of Wildham and the analysis of Wildham that has the water utility paying $2 million more, and the electrical utility will be revisited. Now, there's no error there that's going to force the city to look at it like the $8 million that they've lost so far. But it behooves them, given the fact that it isn't one error to be corrected, but the whole analysis is so chock full with errors that it has to be scrapped and you start over. That analysis by Wildham with regard to the sharing of expenses deserves to be revisited.
Thank you, Mr. Sargos. That pretty much... Oh, okay. Thank you, though. So that brings up a different issue, Mr. Zone, because Wildham did do a cost study analysis for the tier rate structure, but they also did the reallocation, because I would call that portion as well, shifting some costs from the water side for administrative and for other things to bump it up. I think it was like 30-something% to 70-something% on the electric side. So will that analysis also be revisited, or just are you looking at just the cost of study for the tier rate structures?
We plan to look, I don't know specifically if we're looking at that, the adjustment you're referring to, but everything from the tiers to the consumption, the assumptions of consumption, the monthly versus bi-monthly, everything is going to be looked at, including some additional methodologies that we're going to use that we put into place for the electric rates, such as decoupling charges, of which we're being hailed as one of the first agencies to do that. We're looking at that possibility in the water as well, as a regulatory charge and an energy charge, which we already have, but refining those. So I would have to get back to you. I don't know unless Doreen, you know offhand.
Because I guess my question is, before I recall that the administrative charges or the admin, there was a previous allocation of 25% from water and 75% from electric, and then Wildham readjusted that because staff thought that the adjustment, even though Mr. Zarvos thinks that was because of the you can't have the transfer from the water side anymore, so there was a readjustment because that was some of the public's perspective. So would that also be looked at? Do you know?
I don't know that that's what we've tasked Bartle and Wells at looking at here as part of this. I mean, we were looking more at strictly the rate structure. But certainly it's something I can look into and get back to you on.
I was presumed that with the few years that you're on board now, Mr. Zone, that there were some charges that you can strictly allocate to water and strictly allocate to electric. So presumably Mr. Zarvo's argument that those rate structures should fit in nicely, even though it's 30% or is it 25%, you know, so presumably staff has enough information to make that allocation correctly.
Yeah, that would be my assumption, and I haven't seen anything that would change my opinion of that, but since you asked, I'll double check for you.
Great, any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next one.
4B, electric reliability report.
Mr. Boyd.
Good evening, Commissioner Yao, members of the Commission. Roman Obueg, Chief Assistant General Manager for Electric and Water. In the previous months, we have presented some outage reports, some indices, and I believe back in September, I came to you and did some presentation outages and let you know that we will be coming back and show you like a 5-year analysis of benchmarking our performance against the other utilities. And what I have here before you is basically our 5-year performance in comparison with the IOUs, PG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern California Edison, as well as our performance in comparison with our neighbors, the other POUs. So let me start with some definitions, just to set the tone or the stage for this. These are just the definitions that we use, and interruptions, any loss of service. So anytime we lose service, we call that an interruption. A sustained interruption, which is really an outage, is anything that's over 5 minutes. This is what is defined by the industry. It is considered an outage is anything that's 5 minutes or longer. And a planned outage is something that every once in a while is going to come. We send out notices, so we don't count that as an interruption, but a planned outage. But in the standards, there are exclusions that we don't have to count in our indices, and these are either major events, such as the Santa Ana winds that we experienced back in 2011, or any outages that's basically restricted to or limited to facilities that is owned and operated or owned by private companies. So let me show you just the historical of where we are. This is inclusive from 2008 to 2012, starting with the SAFE. The SAFE stands for System Average Interruption Frequency Index. What that means is for every customer within a territory within a period of 12 months, this is the number of outages that they can experience. So from 2008, oh, by the way, our goal that we set up for ourselves is to be at one or less. Okay. And what we do is you compare the definition that I showed you is we look at when we include all the events plus with the events excluded. So just picking out some of the numbers, as you can see here, the numbers that we have, with the exception of PG&E for the most part, we are exceeding or we are higher than the other utilities. And you do that with events included and events excluded. And why is that? One of the reasons this is a very hard index to measure, as we're doing our conversion from 4 kV to 12 kV, we're putting more customers in one feeder. So the more customers we have, every time we have an outage, we actually have a higher number than the other utilities. And you would see this as being more prevalent compared to the MOUs or the other munis. But the SAIDI, which is the System Average Interruption Duration Index, that means this is the average duration that anyone can experience within Glendale if there is an outage. And this is the number that we're very proud of. Our goal is to be around 40 minutes, mainly on the KD, and we hope that would translate to SAIDI. But the only odd year that we had, with the major events included, when we had the windstorm back in December 2011, that's why we have this high number. But in total minutes, if you look at the outages experienced by customers in Edison territory, San Diego, and PG&E, San Diego looks pretty good, but we are performing much, much better than the IOUs with the major events included and even with the events excluded. We're almost right at the 40 minutes, which is the goal that we set for ourselves. Okay? This is the system average. Go ahead.
So your, pardon me, your goal then is less than 40 minutes, both with major events included and excluded?
That is correct.
And then going back to the previous slide on SAFE, so that's less than 1, again, both for major events included and excluded.
That is correct. KD, or the Customer Average Interruption Duration Index, this is more of a minute or a more detailed look at the interruption index instead of system-wide. These are, if you actually saw an outage, how much can you really expect your power to be out? And our goal here is 40 minutes as well. And even with the events included during the windstorm, without averaging it with everything else, we're about twice the goal. But for the most part, we're right at 40 minutes, again, with this being an odd year. And if you look at how we're doing in the recent years, we are right at 40 minutes. Comparing that to our neighboring, the IOUs, they are way over 100 minutes per interruption. So we're at least half better than the IOUs. Now, if we take that and compare that to our neighboring cities with the other munis, on the safety, we have vetted this, and we are. It looks like we're worse than they are again, but taking this into context, as we convert our feeders from 4 kV to 12 kV, we have certain feeders with we have one feeder that has over 12,000 customers in it, and Burbank, their average customer is in hundreds as opposed to thousands. So one outage to them equivalent to us, we have a lot more customers that get impacted. So this is consistent. These are the same numbers, but we're also tracking now to date because we participate in this CAPA benchmarking. So we have continuous data that's available to us so we can continually compare our performance to the other cities. In terms of the SAIDI, this is really what we're really proud of this. Even compared to the other munis, on the average, we are doing much better than the others, with the exception of Burbank. Again, Burbank, the number of customers they have each feeder is much lower than we do. But compared to the other cities, we're comparable, if not better. Okay, compared to our big brother next door, we are always doing much better. Okay. And the Katy, similarly, and this is where really you can count on when you have an outage. This is the advantage that we have in the community. We have our troubleshooters and we have people that come out. And we are, even compared to Burbank, we're performing a lot better, meeting our goal of 40 minutes. In the course of 5 years, what we try to do is we continuously monitor what are the outages that's happening, how many outages are preventable, and what outages are just absolutely driving us nuts, like the squirrels here. We do have several squirrel issues. That's one of the biggest outages that we have. Mylar balloons is another major contributing factor. In fact, yesterday we had an outage because of a Mylar balloon. Most people forget that Mylar balloons, they probably don't realize they don't have to make contacts with the power lines to cause an outage. All they have to do is get near. They're conducting, and so they arc across and they cause what they call, we hear it a lot, a pole fire or an explosion. That's because of the arcing caused by the Mylar balloons. So over the last 5 years, we had a total of 293 outages, and these are these are the things that we monitor as to what's causing it. And the purpose for us doing this is we try to identify what's preventable so that they don't happen again. Okay? And this is the report that you get on a monthly basis from us. You get a monthly report of the outages and the causes, and what we do is we track it. So with that, Commissioner Camargo, I believe you asked this question last meeting, so I hope this answers your question.
I did. I like that. I like where we're headed with this, so very much appreciate seeing the relative performance to other utilities. And I guess, so I'm seeing then that we're within goal, on goal, on with respect to going back to so what is the level to which we are then on plan or reaching our goals? Are we behind on slides? What are they numbered? Slides 4 and 5?
I think we're on track. I mean, it can go up or down. But for the most part, I believe we're on track. To put this in perspective, when we started the improvements that we made back in 2005, and I didn't go back that far, our safety back then is close to 3. Okay, and our SAIDI, or the interruption index, they're close to 200. If I'm not close, it's right at 286 minutes. And we're down to 40 minutes and right at 1 on the safety. So I think we're doing very well. We're meeting the goal that we set up back in
Right.
2005.
And then I'll ask this question. I'm not sure about the appropriateness of this question, so Christine, keep me honest. Then my related question would be, so I really appreciate looking at relative performance, not just our own performance over time, because I think it gives good perspective. But I think the other thing then is, so what are the repercussions of attaining our goals and missing our goals? So that is to say, are these types of performance metrics then built into, performance plans, those types of things?
That's the performance that we measure our success here as a service provider. And the other condition, or the other reward, if you will, that we benefit from this is APPA, American Public Power Association, has what they call an RP3 program, Reliable Public Power Provider. And one of the benefits that we have received from meeting this goal is we have been the recipient of the RP3 for the last 4 years. Now they give it every 2 years, and we're only 276, one of 276 utilities out of over 2,000 utilities that have received that recognition. And that's one of the advantages of getting that.
To follow up a little bit on that as well, this is something that consistently on an annual basis we use in our goal setting and accomplishments, and will be a key factor in our updated strategic plan. This is a very important issue. Something I want to point out too, because I think we should be very proud of the numbers that our utilities putting up. But keep in mind that up until the point, and we still haven't put those monies together, up until the point that the electric bond funded in December, we had suspended the capital program. So this is a lot of hard work since 2005 and some great maintenance over the last 18 months that Ramon and his staff have put into to ensure that we maintain this reliability scale. This is something we're really proud of. This is something we tout when we go out into the public. And for folks who've lived here for some time, you may remember what it was like pre-2005 when we were reaching those 286 minutes and we were at those level 3s for some of our incidents. I know in going through at least the initial outreach meetings for the electric rates, there were folks who clearly, we didn't have any question on that. They remembered multiple outages occurring during that period, and we're grateful for that effort. And I think Ramon and his staff deserve certainly some kudos for that. I'm proud of them for that. But also, never resting on our laurels, it's something that we want to maintain on an ongoing basis. This is what we want to be known for. One of the things we want to be known for is an ultra-reliable utility. Because this is our credibility, this is our integrity, this is our reputation. We want to maintain that, and I certainly do, and that will be at the top of our list when it comes to goal setting, meeting our annual objectives, and any strategic planning efforts we put into place.
So then it seems to follow then if we would, it is impressive work, and really do appreciate the relative performance. If we got it to a point where we then fell behind plan and we're not meeting our goals, it sounds like there's a commitment to then go back in and look at an improvement plan to get us back on track.
Absolutely.
Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
We use the outage incidents that we have also to define some of the capital projects that we have to do where we need to focus. This is a continuous process.
And just to not to belabor the point, but a lot of the modernization efforts we've made have also been aimed at reliability. That's the primary goal of those. And we still have some of those to put into place, where you're able to detect outages quicker. You're able to make automated adjustments from remote locations to help get power at least restored to part of those that are out, so that we don't have to wait to have boots on the ground go out there and do that. So those are all efforts that are also helping us in that area as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Or C, Neodora Drive West Side Stream Report.
From what we're seeing will come up. This item is a result of an email, I think, that most, if not all of you, received from some concerned residents on Neodora Drive regarding what we call the West Side Stream, and really the suspension of us introducing water into that stream initially to provide maintenance. The source of the water comes from the Verdugo Park Water Treatment Plant. So initially it was for maintenance, and then as we began to look as what is become our standard operating procedure, to look at all of our operations and see which of those are performing financially and operationally well, and those that aren't, and we need to start looking at doing something different, either improving those that aren't or eliminating those. In this particular case, there was some question as to whether this treatment plant was viable. If it was, for the cost that we were putting out, was it economically viable for us to continue to operate it? That's something that we are undertaking, a review that we are undertaking. In the meantime, that continues to, we've ceased the flow of water. We did that in mid-November. And I think there's some concern on the part of the residents of whether that's going to be reinitiated or not. And that's sparked a whole series of questions and research that Doreen is undertaking. So she's going to give you a synopsis of that, talk to you about history, because it has a long history, some of the legal ramifications that we're facing with this, and just from an operational standpoint. Again, that economic viability of operating this plant, and if it doesn't make sense, there is a greater good to all ratepayers in the city that we do and that we operate as most efficient, cost-effective way. So that comes into play as well. But with that, I'll turn it over to Doreen.
Thank you. Good evening again, President Yao, Commission members. I have a brief PowerPoint for you, again, providing some history on the stream and what the present status is. The Neodora Stream, or sometimes we refer to it as the West Side Stream, but I'll refer to it as the Neodora Stream, it runs along Neodora Drive and Fernbrook Lane. It is historically, it has been a natural stream, which means that the flow of the water in the stream is dependent on groundwater levels. A little bit of history based on what I could find in various documents, and I'll go over what documents I've been able to get my hands on, shows that in 1906, Glendale was incorporated. The stream appears to already have been existent. In 1914, Glendale's water department was organized. In 1923, Glendale acquired water rights to the basin and agreed to maintain a flow of 10 minors inches in the stream up until May 31st of 1930. In 1927, Glendale, in the interim, in 1927, Glendale agreed to extend the delivery of water to the stream until 1942. In 1942, the discharge of water into the stream was discontinued, and there is no evidence of any action concerning the Neodora Stream between 1942 and the early 1980s.
Oh, Mr. Matosian, can you clarify on 1927?
Yes.
Did Glendale agree with the residents in the area, or who did they agree with to extend the delivery of the water to the stream?
President Yao, it's unclear, and where I got this information from, and I'll go into the environmental impact report that sort of sets forth the history, is from an EIR, an environmental impact report, which was conducted for the Verdugo Park water treatment plant, which I will discuss later in my PowerPoint. Unfortunately, I'm still digging to see if I can find more documents, if I can find more information on the history of the stream.
But there's no documentation where the counterparty is the other party that Glendale is negotiating with, or?
Unfortunately, no. I'll go through the list of documents that I have been able to obtain to date.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
The environmental impact report that I just referred to, or the EIR, was dated April 16, 1984. It was a report conducted to study the impacts of a proposed well field, which was to go into the Verdugo Park. The proposed project consisted of 7 wells in that well field. The EIR concluded that the well field project would not affect the Neodora stream flow because at most, according to the EIR, the flow would be reduced by 10%. Therefore, the report concluded that no further mitigation measures concerning the stream would be necessary. Now, the actual project that was built And what is currently there consists of 2 wells, which is substantially less in magnitude than the proposed 7-well field. There is a resolution, resolution number 96-142. It is dated September 17, 1996. It was passed by the Glendale City Council, or adopted by the Glendale City Council. By that resolution, the City Council basically stated that the city would be able to release a small quantity of water. The resolution does not say what that small quantity is to be into the stream if the property owners were to execute a liability release agreement in favor of the city. The documents that staff has been able to obtain thus far is a memo dated August 1996 from the Glendale Water and Power Director to the city manager. That memo is what resulted in the resolution that I just mentioned. There's a cooperation agreement between the owners of the properties that are affected by the stream. Regarding the West Side Stream, the city is not a part of that agreement, that cooperation agreement. And there is an unsigned agreement between the city and the resident or residents. Based on my understanding, based on what I have found thus far, the agreement was intended to be signed between the city and all of the residents. I have been able to locate one agreement which is signed by the residents but not the city. The terms in the city agreement was that the city would use best efforts to refrain from discontinuing the release of water without reasonable cause, and some reasonable causes were deemed to be drought conditions. And as a side note, we recently received our first drought notice issued by CDPH, and we are expecting the governor to make a decision or a ruling in February of this year. Non-operation of the Verdugo Park treatment plant, which is what we have currently, and I'll get into that a little further on. Operational problems, water contamination, or by government order. Glendale Water and Power has been releasing and was releasing 35 gallons per minute into the stream. That's almost 18.4 million gallons of water per year. The approximate cost of water released into the stream is $48,000 per year. Of course, that could go up based on Metropolitan Water District rates. And of course, as we all know, since the 1980s, there are new legal mandates concerning the proportionality of the costs associated with water service to property owners benefiting from such services, and that would include the stream. In November 15 of 2013, the release of water into the stream was stopped, and the reason that GWP stopped releasing water into the stream was for the purpose of conducting some necessary maintenance to the water treatment plant. In advance of stopping the release of water, 2 letters were sent to the residents affected by the stream. One was dated October 21st, the other November 1st. The letters advised the residents that the water would not be released pending the maintenance to the treatment plant. On December 13th, an additional letter was sent to the residents advising them that GWP was conducting a study of the treatment plant to assess the economic viability of the plant. Staff has issued requests for proposals to evaluate the viability of the treatment plant. At issue, one of the issues is the plant being designed for almost 1,000 gallons per minute extraction from the 7 wells. However, presently, with 2 wells, we are only at 225 gallons per minute. And the existing wells also need to be rehabilitated. The extent of the rehabilitation we'll find out once the study is complete. The results of the study are expected in February 2014, and in the letter that was sent to the residents, which I mentioned, dated December 13th, we also advised them that Glendale Water and Power would hold community meeting after the issuance of the results. Since that time, we have been in touch with the residents, Mr. Obweg and I am still diligently looking for additional documents. The stream has been there for a long time. It has great history behind it, and of course, hopefully I'll find more, and it goes. That I'll be happy to answer.
So right now, the stream is dry, and has this issue been brought up to the city council since this was brought up into an email?
The city manager's been briefed on this, but we wouldn't be going to the city council outside of whatever briefing we go through the city manager until we have definitive results from our evaluation, and then with staff recommendations on. Sure.
Yeah, and I guess there's some legal remedies if the residents do find that the stream has been there for a while and then the city has cut them off and there's no records what the agreement was. So potentially this could drag on. So what kind of situation that can help the residents feel that they need this stream to maybe increase their property value or live the lifestyle that they're accustomed to?
Well, Mr. Yao, members of the commission, until we get all of the information that we can together and then make a final legal decision from the city attorney's office, there's really nothing more that we're going to do. Especially, I have a great concern about Proposition 218 violations and the fact that we're essentially giving water away. But if for some reason something we've done in the past legally allows us to do that, then that's another area to pursue. But until I have that information from Christine and from Doreen, we don't plan to introduce water in there. We don't plan to restart that plant, period, until we get the evaluation done on its viability for the future as well. But those are two things, the operational issue with the plant, but also the final legal opinion that would essentially be given to council about their opinion on where we should go in the future, if we should go anywhere in the future. I don't know if you have more to add to that.
No, I think that's accurate. We really can't assess at this point what the rights are of the residents absent further documentation. Based on what we've seen so far, there doesn't seem to be any legal binding obligation on the city to continue that flow of water.
Commissioner Hale?
Yeah, I would also add that even if the what appears to be the legal agreement between the city and GWP and these residents were to hold up, we're very close to being in drought conditions this year, meaning that we're under no obligation to pump water into the ground that could otherwise be used for drinking. And a lot has probably changed in that community since 1984 when the agreement was, or I guess 1996 is when the agreement dates back to, with the resolution. Council resolution.
Yes.
So there may be new residents, new property owners that have no obligation, that are receiving a public benefit from the utility that no other resident around the city is receiving. So, I mean, this is, I think if there are any legal issues here, it would be on the city side and GWP side, not, for providing a benefit to these residents, at least from my perspective. So look forward to hearing the full analysis of that.
And how many residents are impacted? How many letters do we send out?
Approximately 20.
And a follow-up question on that, if I can.
Sure.
What is the level to which those 20 people represent all the residents who live along the stream?
I believe that is all the residents who live along the stream.
Okay,
Mr. Boyd. Well, I understand, but is that accurate? Yes.
I believe so. I believe those 20 property owners are impacted by the stream or have the stream on their properties.
Okay. So sorry, maybe I'm not asking the question correctly. So they all live along the stream. Is it 20 people? Is that the total number of people who live along the stream? I'm trying to understand if the folks who live along the stream are unified on this, or if we're simply hearing from some portion of the people who live along the stream.
We are meeting with the residents who live along the stream, and the answer to your question, Commissioner, is we don't know at this point. In fact, we're going to be meeting with the residents next Wednesday evening, Ramona Boyd and I, and we'll get to hear more from them, and we'll see where each of the property owners stands with regards to the stream.
One other question is one of the options that we're exploring or can explore the ability for the folks who live along this stream to pay for the cost themselves?
Yes.
Okay.
That is an option, but as Commissioner Hale indicated, even with that option, if that was implemented, if there are drought conditions, then that would impact whether we could release water into the stream.
Well, we have one speaker. Maybe we can, after the speaker, we can have some more discussion. Arthur Chachian.
President Yao, Commissioners, my name is Arthur Charchin, and I'm a very proud resident of the Verdugo Woodlands. One of the reasons I moved to that neighborhood is it's a historic neighborhood in Glendale, dating back to the 1920s when it was first established by Mr. Newport of the F.W. Newport Company, who focused on the stream and the natural, two natural streams over in the area that gave this part of Glendale an appeal that it did not have versus Los Angeles and other areas that was being developed at the time. So I think we need to focus not on just the finances, but what this stream means to Glendale from a historic perspective. The documents that I've seen, as early as 1926, neighbors were talking with each other, cooperating over boundary lines, over enhancements to the stream bed, and so forth. And so these are important issues to consider. I think that a more important issue to consider is what's the benefit or the good for all of Glendale. Mr. Hill had a very good comment, and I do agree that this is not just a property owner issue. I'm not here as a property owner saying, hey, turn on the water, I want water to flow in front of my property or the side of my property. But I think that there's a bigger issue here. The city of Glendale fought a very hard battle with the county of Los Angeles over the right for the wells that were supposed to be put into place. Millions of dollars and lots of time was spent in legal battles and back and forth with the county of Los Angeles so that Glendale could have its water rights. And what I'm hearing, and I'm sure that the city doesn't want to go there, but what I'm hearing is a potential is that we're going to just give up those rights that we fought so hard for in the 80s. And I remember as a much younger person hearing about and reading about that Glendale wants to give up the ability to pump its own water. And in a period of time where we have $8 million deficits that are accounting errors by consultants, and where ratepayers are seeing rate increases, I think it would be our responsibility to pump our own water that Glendale has a legal right to pump. So I think the question shouldn't be asked from the perspective of what are these 20 homeowners with this stream doing. I think the bigger question is, why do we have 2 wells when we can have 7? And why can't we get this pumping station to the 1,150, I think it was, gallons per minute that it's designed to produce? These are huge capital expenditures that were done to get that treatment plant to pump that much volume and treat that much volume. I'm sorry, the wells pump it and the treatment plant treats it. So I think that's a concern. As far as the legal issues and the battle and so forth, there was legal battles in the 90s. There were lawsuits. I wouldn't want to see the city mired in those types of things. These things are, lawsuits occur, as an attorney, lawsuits occur when people don't communicate well. And I think an opportunity here is to communicate with the residents, to communicate with the city, and do what's best for the city as a whole. Also, we have not seen in this presentation, and I'm sure that it's because the data is just not completely there, but the idea of the West Side Stream was an environmental impact report adjustment from what I was told when I first moved to the neighborhood. Water in this stream, from the neighbors that live next door, they lived there since 36, their family, 1936. They saw the water in the stream dry up in 1986. Not because of what the city of Glendale did, but because the development up the road caused the water to dry up. And over a decade of different battles, they finally in 1996 agreed, okay, we will pump more water into the stream. We saw some information where they were saying small amounts and so forth. And that small amount, I just want to say, is the 35 gallons per minute that was referenced in the report that led to the city commission's acting on it in 1996. The environmental impact of this water is that it's supposed to flow through the stream to Verdugo Park and then go into the aquifer and then be repumped again. So when you're seeing those numbers, that 18 million gallons, that sounds like a huge number. But in reality, this is water that's being recycled through the system, and in the process is feeding the sycamore trees There's a lot of sycamore trees in this area, and the oak trees draw from deeper, but this is a huge environmental issue as well. And the last thing we need in the city of Glendale is to be dealing and mired in environmental issues when I think we can find a resolution. I think the resolution is to look for options to pump more of our own water versus going and buying it at high rates from the Metropolitan Water District, which will only increase rates. And I see that my time is up, so
Yes,
thank you.
We have actually another speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chachian. Catherine Julia, please.
Hi, thank you. It's Catherine Yurka. I'm here. I'm also a resident of Niobrara Drive, but I'm actually on the other side of the street where there is no stream currently, although there was historically. I just wanted to let the commissioners and the president know. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on. That I'm the author of an application to have Niobrara Drive declared a historic district. The stream is a very important part of that, and if you want to learn more about the history of it and of the neighborhood, the application is online. You can just Google Niobrara Drive Historic District, and it's 25-page history, which has a lot of information about the stream because it's so central to the identity of that street in the neighborhood. So I just wanted to let you know that. And I've let Doreen know as well, so she'll be able to get some more information. Thanks.
Thank you. Comments or questions? Mrs. Zone, go ahead.
So yeah, just a couple of clarifications. One, obviously there's a lot of different opinions on the history of this particular issue, which is one of the reasons we're doing the analysis and going back in the history. So, some of the suppositions and at least, what was passed down or what was somebody's interpretation, we're trying to pull those all together because there's many different interpretations of that. In regards to the operations of the plant, as I said, that's another thing we're evaluating, whether these wells are still viable, whether that plant's future is viable, and that includes all of the recharge that was discussed as well. But let me most importantly point out, we're not giving up our water rights in any way, shape, or form, nor are we backing off on well production. In fact, my goal is to steadily increase our production from our own wells, and Mr. Abweg is working very hard with his water staff in that regard. Just the straight cost differential between MWD water and our well water alone is the motivation for doing that. And we have gone through and already made certain evaluations, are doing some upgrades to our wells, and all in an effort to get an increase in our well production. But at the end of the day, as you may be aware, and some wells just for whatever reason stop producing and aren't viable, and to try to pump small amounts of water out of them doesn't become economically feasible. So we've got to evaluate that as well. But by no means are we going to back off from our own well production or give up our water rights anywhere.
Yeah, in terms of water rights, I want to clarify, we're looking at the Verdugo Basin. We have two sets of wells. One is in the Verdugo Park and the other one's in Glorieta. So we are currently, and we have just upgraded some of the wells in Glorieta. So the goal, as Mr. Stern indicated, our goal has been to optimize our well production to the extent that we can minimize our reliance on MWD. So just want to clarify that.
No, I agree with. Go ahead, Mr. Hill.
Yeah, is the economic analysis of the Verdugo treatment plant a full CEQA EIR process, or is it something short of that at this point?
No, I don't believe we've got that. It's a consultant engineering evaluation of the treatment plant operation and the well production.
Just curious.
We're certainly not at that stage yet.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just doing an RFP.
Yeah, I was just wondering what that was entailed. Thanks.
It seems like there will be some follow-ups, and I'm sure this is a very important issue for the residents impacted. So
we'll come back, Mr. Yao, once we've got some more definitive answers, and we've gone through, as you saw that in the presentation Doreen had, we'll be making some. We'll have at least one community meeting where we convey the results to the residents of the area, and especially those that are directly in front of the stream.
can we note the presentation mentioned the results of the study will be expected in February. Can we have a follow-up in March?
Yeah,
for this
let's
issue?
tentatively put that down, and I think that's doable.
Well, in the meantime, there's really nothing that the residents can do at this point to get the water back on for the stream. So we're just part of the process.
We won't, the city won't be introducing any water into that stream in the interim period until we get back the results and then make a final decision on what direction we want to go in.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next item, please.
Or D, feed-in tariff analysis / net energy metering.
Mr. President, members of the commission, this is a follow-up, a long-awaited follow-up to, I think some questions Mr. Yao had, but I'm going to ask Mr. Peters, who has done the yeoman's work in putting this all together, and to explain to you a little bit about how the rate structures were put together and answer any questions you may have.
Good evening. My name is Lon Peters. I'm the Integrated Resources Planning Administrator. I report to Mr. Linz. I didn't realize that yeoman was part of my title, but I think we can add that on. Yeah, that's right. Okay, I'm here to answer some questions that have come up at previous commission meetings about the feed-in tariff, and now that the net energy metering tariff structure has been changed to indicate how those are connected. So I'm going to move through. Oh, good, it worked. All right, we have two programs to pay residential and commercial customers inside the city for distributed generation. This is mostly solar at this point and is expected to be for some time given the technologies and costs. The feed-in tariff was started it was adopted last summer by City Council. It was a requirement of state law. And under the feed-in tariff, we will pay directly for the output of separately metered solar installations distributed across the city. The net energy metering program started several years ago. There are about 350 accounts, roughly, on net metering. These are also all separately metered as the feed-in tariff installations are. There are about 500 kW of connected solar capacity under the net energy metering tariff. In comparison, our peak load during the summer is about 300 megawatts, or 300,000 kW. And the customers are billed for net consumption, and they may get a credit at the end of the year if their actual production of energy exceeds the amount that they consume on site. Now, some of this is going to be repeat from previous commission presentations. This one is one that you've seen before. There are certain considerations in the statute that govern the structure of the feed-in tariff rate itself. I'm not going to read through these, but there are certain principles that we need to follow when we're setting up the rate structure, and I'll show how we've adopted these principles when I walk through the rate structure itself. Basically, we should pay avoided costs. We should make sure that the other customers who are not on the feed-in tariff are neutral to the payments made to the customers who are on the feed-in tariff.
Are we on the right slide?
I'm sorry? I missed the slide, excuse me. All right, there are the statutory considerations. This is how we determine what we pay the customers, and there is this neutrality provision at the end. Okay, so the next step then would be, and this is the statutory language, we break it down, we take the statutory language, we break it down into components to reflect the avoided energy cost. We look at the wholesale energy markets, what we would otherwise pay if we were out buying power to serve loads inside the city. We would otherwise have to buy some renewable energy. We characterize that as paying for RECs, paying for renewable energy credits. We might buy that as bundled energy or as unbundled RECs. To the extent that we have local generation that is not fossil-based, we conserve the free allowances that we receive from the state for carbon or CO2 equivalent, and that conservation of those allowances allows us to bank them and use them in future periods for compliance. So they have a future value. And finally, we reflect time of use as per the statute by paying a heavy load hour base, that is a peak period based price. And I'll go to the very end here briefly. I have these in a different order to show you. There was a question that came up about what the periods are. So in response to the questions a few months ago, what does our load shape look like and how does that connect to the wholesale markets that we operate in. This is I looked at actual data, hourly data from 2012, and I pulled out 2 weekdays, one in January and one in August, that looked like they were typical of weekday consumption. You can see here the load varies quite a bit, peaking at about 150 megawatts when people go home and start turning on appliances and lights in the evening, and the very low period is in the middle of the night. The vertical lines are indicators of the definition in the wholesale market of peak period. So when we're out in the wholesale market buying energy to serve the loads, we pay peak period prices and off-peak period prices, typically when we're buying blocks of power. And that peak period price would apply to anything that gets delivered that we purchase and delivered to the residents between hours ending 6 o'clock in the morning, or starting 6 o'clock in the morning and ending at 10 o'clock at night. That's the peak period, Monday through Saturday, and the remaining hours are off-peak. Here's the same curve for a summer day. You can see I picked the hottest day I could find last summer to show you how high it might get. The peak we've actually experienced on the system is about 335, so this is pretty close to the highest historical peak. And you can see it's about double what our winter load shape is, but it's got the same kind of shape. The loads peak in the late afternoon. In this case, it's for cooling purposes, or so. And again, the wholesale periods are defined the same way. So if we go back to how do we actually then apply this formula, I look at the forward curves, which means I'm looking at prices for power that we could purchase now for future delivery. And I do this on a quarterly basis. So back in December, I looked at Meade is a point on the grid in the Southwest where we buy power and sell power. And I looked at the prices that were then posted for transactions that would take place during the first quarter, the first 3 months of 2014, for the peak period and the off-peak period. Then I looked at, we have some contractual data and some measured data on losses, because when we have local generation instead of importing, we avoid the losses that we would otherwise incur on the transmission and distribution systems. And you can see those loss factors vary depending on where you are on the transmission system and whether it's transmission versus distribution. We add all those up and we get about 7.5% losses that we avoid. We want to make sure we reflect that in the value that we pay to the customers. And then we want to reflect the value of the renewable energy itself. And back in the late summer, we actually did some transactions for what's called Portfolio Content Category 1, which is the highest value in-state renewable energy. We paid about $26 over index, so we can include that $26 in the formula. And then we have the value of the conserved free carbon allowances, and I looked at a bid-ask spread that was posted that we receive through a service called Carbone. And again, this shows some transactions for carbon allowances. The carbon allowances each have a vintage, in this case 2013 and 2014, but I took the average of the two to get us into the ballpark of what a carbon allowance was worth toward the end of December of last year.
Mr. Peters, may I ask if the REC price and the GHG price vary month to month as well?
If we were in the short-term market for RECs every day, for example, every month, we could see changes from month to month in the REC price. That would be on the secondary market where individual utilities are offering or brokers are offering surplus RECs that we might purchase, or when we're trying to sell RECs if we thought we had some surplus RECs.
So can you give us an idea what the range would be for even the secondary market, what the price differential between month to month?
I've seen it since I've been here, I've seen it as low as low 20s and as high as mid to upper 30s for very short-term transactions. And then with respect to the greenhouse gases or the CO2 equivalent, these are secondary market prices, not auction results. They are quarterly auctions. The secondary market tends to track the auction results pretty closely. But again, there are transactions that take place on an irregular basis in the secondary market, and those prices can also change generally on a week. We get information on a weekly basis about the secondary market. There's not a lot of variation week to week in these short-term prices of these two commodities at least. So those are the inputs. Then once we have, I should back up for a second, we've got the off-peak and the on-peak energy prices, the loss factor, the rec price, the greenhouse gas price. We add all of those up, basically. We take the energy price that we would otherwise have to pay. We take the loss factor, multiply that by the energy price to reflect the fact that we're not losing energy when on the transmission distribution systems. We add in the rec value. The greenhouse gas value is the price of an allowance times the number of allowances per megawatt hour of generic energy that we would purchase on the market. If we were, this is not the coal allowance per megawatt hour rate, which is about 1. It's not the hydro allowance per megawatt hour rate, which of course is 0. It's it's the generic market, Western U.S. market rate, which is basically driven by natural gas emissions. So we would avoid, or we would conserve, for each megawatt hour that we buy from a customer or kilowatt hour, we would conserve an allowance, a fraction of an allowance, based on what we'd otherwise have to buy. That adds another $5 to the price approximately. We end up with about $74 and $67 for this particular calendar quarter, peak and off-peak. And again, these will be updated each quarter. Now we have these additional rate provisions. This again is a slide you've seen before. We have the indifference principle, the avoided cost principle. We have not dealt with bullet number 3 explicitly yet. That is reflecting peak demand on the system, which could be defined as a very narrow set of hours during the late afternoon, for example, when the loads are at their highest level, and we might be paying extra high prices on the wholesale market just for that short period of time. And then the statute refers to other attributes of renewable generation. It doesn't say specifically what that means. So here is a new slide. Here are some options that we might want to consider with regard to changing the way we set the FIT rate in the future to encourage more local distributed generation, but while maintaining adherence to the principle of indifference on the part of other customers. The first one addresses the bullet from the previous slide. We've not included anything with respect to avoided or deferred costs of distribution upgrades. My understanding is that this would require a very specific analysis of individual feeders on the distribution system. So if we knew a solar project was going in on one feeder, that might allow certain work to be deferred, and that might increase the value to the other customers, because that cost would then be avoided for some period of time or deferred for a lengthy period of time. I'm not the expert on the distribution system. We could, for example, and then the second bullet addresses another potential adjustment. We could go back and look at historical prices on an hourly basis, and we have done this last year when the retail rates were set to determine a super peak period. Look at historical prices in the California Independent System Operator and see if there might be a reason to, or a basis to award a higher price to the feed-in tariff customers during the hours that they were actually contributing generation to the system, and we were avoiding even higher prices during, say, the late afternoon or early evening in the summer. And then the last bullet is sort of a catch-all, and I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question. I'm certainly willing to listen to suggestions. So other things that we could do, for example, we've heard that a quarterly rate, a rate that changes every quarter, is a bit of a problem if you're trying to finance a long-term project. I understand that. I'm in the middle of negotiations on other projects that we might purchase, other renewable energy projects, and financing, of course, is an issue. and having a revenue stream that can be counted on is important to a developer and to whoever's financing. So that might be a possibility. We could look at what we're seeing in the market for 20, 25-year contracts for solar production and look at the value of the REC that we would have to pay for that energy and perhaps fix that price for a similar period of time. Perhaps that would help developers get financing. We could potentially look at a forecast of, I don't know exactly what the source would be at this point, but a forecast of allowance prices. So if we're actually saving an allowance or a portion of an allowance today, we put that in the allowance bank, as I call it, and we use it 10 years from now, 5 years from now. We might be able to reflect that future value in a payment to a feed-in tariff customer. But on the other hand, and we have to be very careful about this, whenever we buy renewable energy and actually bring it to the city and serve load with that renewable energy, we are getting a renewable energy credit because it's green energy, but we're also avoiding carbon. So we get, when we pay $25, for example, on top of index, if the price on the market is $50 and we pay $75 for that energy because it's renewable, we're getting two values. We're getting a carbon value and we're getting a renewable energy value. And we don't want to violate the indifference rule with respect to other customers. So some of these adjustments could increase the price to the feed-in tariff customers. Some of these adjustments could go in the opposite direction too as we continue to think about this and refine this. Now, with respect to net energy metering, as I mentioned, this is the other way that we compensate or pay for customers for distributed generation. It's been around for a while. The financing or the payment structure is very different. Instead of waiting for the customer to come in, instead of paying on a quarterly basis as we set up the feed-in tariff, certain payments were made early on when the customers originally applied for net energy metering status. So in a sense, we pre-purchased all of the renewable energy credits associated with that solar energy by giving the customer some money up front to help get the system installed. So in some sense, we've already paid for that. If we want to adhere to the indifference principle with respect to the other customers, we don't want to pay again. And then the customer, in the case of net energy metering, receives value every month because they're avoiding the payment of the retail rate whenever their solar units are actually producing energy. And then the NEM customer receives the option at the end of the year. If they've produced more than they've consumed during that year, there's a certain quantity of surplus energy which they can either bank on a volumetric basis and use as a credit against future bills, or they can get a cash out. It's a different structure for payment. But we can, and we have, tried to blend these two different ways of paying for distributed solar generation to make them somewhat comparable. And part of this was prompted by the fact that the fuel adjustment clause was the basis for the payments for surplus energy at the end of the year for the net energy metering customers who had the surplus energy, and the FAC went away last year because the entire retail rate structure was changed. And so at the end of the year, Council decided to move to a fit-based approach so that we could say that whether you're a net energy metering customer or a feed-in tariff customer, going forward, you're being treated in a fairly similar manner. Given that the net energy metering customers had already been paid for the RECs, we simply took the REC value out of the formula. So we went to paying them avoided cost, paying them for the carbon, avoided carbon, paying them for the avoided distribution losses, but not again paying them for the RECs. And if we modify the FIT formula in the future, we could go back and look at the NEM formula as well, but again, it would only apply to the cash out portion at the end of the year, not to long-term, or it could apply to that, or it could apply to on a long-term basis as well.
Mr. Peters, I have a quick question on that. I recall the report to council, but as potentially if I were a NEM customer, which option would I benefit? Would I benefit from the FIT tariff, or should I bank and convert my surplus into cash. Based on these two options that we presented, which option should I be?
Are we talking only about the net energy metering customers right now?
Right, right.
So at the end of the year, the way I understand the retail rate structure, I would be better off as a customer banking the energy, because then I could use that to offset the full retail rate of 14 cents, 15 cents in the following calendar year, instead of being paid 6, 8 cents up front. And there are some customers who choose one because they would prefer to actually have the money, and there are others who are willing to wait and get the money later.
Yeah, because I recall the report saying that the customers who don't make an option, they automatically get paid, right, in cash, rather than continuing on.
I'd like to, I think Christine.
That's the case currently, but that will change with the next calendar year. So starting with at the end of this year, customers will have to affirmatively elect to receive one of those options.
And
that's based on state law. If they don't, then the utility can keep the energy. But a notice goes out to every customer to advise them, make sure they're aware that they need to affirmatively make that choice.
Okay, so it's not even a default to cash out. They just lose that credit.
The way it is now, it's a default. It's a default, and they do get to keep that energy. But starting in the future, it won't be.
Okay, and that's the end of the presentation. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any questions or comments? The gentleman?
A couple of questions. Have we looked at, I know that when this was initially presented, we were given some rates from other cities. Do we have an idea of what kind of movement other cities have as far as actual contracts being approved or contracts being applied for? Is there any movement on that side? Do we know?
My understanding is the bulk of the activity is happening in Los Angeles, who offered the highest rates, and that other cities who offered rates that were certainly, some offered rates that were lower than ours. They're not getting much activity. Sacramento, I think, offered rates that were higher, but they have a different geographical territory, and so they have more opportunities for larger installations, which can take advantage of economies of scale and get their costs down to the point where the rate that SMUD offers is attractive. But I think the bulk of the activity is in Los Angeles, which offered to pay twice what we've offered, but of course they were criticized by some for doing so.
I guess the fundamental question really is, if you take a look at the peak time, that range, right? What is the true cost range when we're at 150 megawatts versus 300? What is that difference? How much extra do we pay, let's say at 8 a.m. on average versus at 3 p.m.? When we're on peak, I'm assuming there is not, it's dynamic pricing, right?
Yes, it can be.
It can be.
Yeah, I think the easier example would be during the summer, when the prices are more likely to spike during extremely hot periods that go on for several days or a couple of weeks at a time. And that price differential between the super peak hours, which could be, say, 4 to 8 o'clock in the evening, versus the average of the entire peak period, which starts at 6 o'clock in the morning, that ratio could be as high as 2 to 1.
Okay. Have we done an analysis if we were to actually shorten the peak period or have a super peak period, let's say between the hours of 12 and between noon and 8 p.m., for example, which is a shorter range of time? Have we done an analysis of what that would translate into the actual offering for the FIT program?
I've not done that, not yet. No, we haven't done that. I mean, we could certainly look at how we could refine the peak period and divide it into a super peak, a short super peak, or a longer super peak.
I mean, from all of these options, I think that's the simplest exercise to do, just to get an idea of what that difference will be. Is it a significant difference? How much would it be? And does it make sense for the city, right? At the end of the day, the metrics are what they are. And if there is a significant difference that makes sense for contractors, then they'll apply. If not, it's up to them. Easy calculation for us to do, probably, to try to at least encourage applicants. That would be the.
It would be relatively straightforward, yes.
Very straightforward, and I don't think we should go to the rate that Los Angeles did, but I think there is movement somewhere in between. There is some, at least for maybe 6 months out of the year, that might work really well for some contractors. Because I look at the rates, and there's a significant difference from 6, 7 a.m. versus 3 p.m. It's a huge difference, almost 100% difference in the megawatts per hour used, and I'm sure the pricing is probably exponential at that point in time. It's not necessarily one-to-one proportional increase.
Well, it depends on, again, how we would be buying the energy in lieu of this. If we bought it in advance, 2 or 3 months in advance, it would be a fixed price for all 16 hours a day. But if we were in a position where all of a sudden we had not purchased that in advance and the loads were much higher than we had expected them to be, which can certainly happen, we could easily be on the spot market on an hourly basis.
And our normal practice is to buy it in advance?
We cover almost the entire expected load for any given month we have locked in before the month starts. Yes. What we expect it to be. Of course, what it actually is something different.
Good. So I would just, maybe if it's not too much work, a simple exercise of calculating a smaller super peak and seeing if, I don't know if the rest of the commissioners have any thoughts on that. That would be the only advice.
Yeah, the thought that I would add is when you're doing that analysis to figure out how much we could invest in terms of feed-in tariff to shave off that super peak, that we also compare that to what's available in the renewable marketplace for transmission that is transmission accessible to what GWP has rights to. That we have a sense of what the avoided cost to do that with renewables would be from a PPA as opposed to a feed-in tariff approach.
Certainly, and we have information on that through SCAPA, through which we get dozens and dozens of offers for solar energy, for example.
As part of our review of this process and to see what kind of response we got, or did we get no response, that may shape how revisions we would propose to the overall rate structure. But that's an exercise we intend to go through, and we'll include that in there as well.
In that recent comment, when you take a look at the actual SCAPA report as far as what was actually proposed, are you looking at proposals or actual projects that went into force? Proposals can be in various different ranges. It doesn't mean they were actually built out, or it was feasible, or it was financeable by anybody. Somebody could come in and give a lot of, lowball anything, but it doesn't mean it was actually went through.
Certainly, and that's a concern whenever we look at any proposal through SCAPA. If it's $10 cheaper than all the rest of them, we wonder what causes it to be cheaper. There may be legitimate reasons, and it may also be an offer that isn't realistic. I'm trying to remember what the original question was what's the range of prices that we're receiving, or approximate level, or?
What, my original question?
Yes.
To calculate a super peak.
The super peak, yes, I can, yeah, that's a different question. With respect to the renewable energy, though, we're getting offers for solar power that range by probably $10 to $20 across the offers. Some of them are already built. Most of them are not built.
Questions? Well, Mr. Peters, since you're an expert here, I just want to ask some questions about the intent of this feed-in tariff. I guess the legislators wanted to have more increase in renewables and to localize those renewables by having each municipality or IOUs built this cost structure so that the investors or owners can make that investments and get some funding back for those renewable energy. So from that perspective, I would assume that there should be some kind of a differences between different renewable energy. And I think for the Glendale water and power feed-in tariff, we're assuming a straight renewable energy cost structure where it was built in, whether that be wind, biogas, solar. Is there a way to break out those different renewable energy and maybe look at the cost structures of that? If a customer is interested in importing or exporting solar power, couldn't that feed-in tariff be different for just that customer rather than on an average renewable energy for all the other customers who are interested?
If we can go back to, for example, let's take this slide here that shows the summer. And there were two concepts there that I heard. One was, what does it cost to build it? The second one, and of course that is going to vary greatly by the technology, by the location, and by the size of the project. The other question, though, is how much should we pay for it? And those two may be two very different numbers. But to go to the question of how much could we pay for it, if we're paying for solar, so does this have a pointer on it? No. Well, whatever. If we're paying for solar, the solar is going to come on at 6 o'clock in the morning and it's going to go off at 9, 10 o'clock at night during the summer. We would pay for the solar during the peak period. It would receive only a peak period price. It wouldn't receive any off-peak pricing at all, because it would not be operating during the off-peak period. If someone came into the city and said, I found a geothermal site in my backyard, and it's going to produce 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, well, then that customer would be paid something for the peak period and something for the off-peak period as well. So the pricing, the tariff structure, the feed-in tariff formula, adjusts to the technology because it pays according to the shape of the actual output. So if somebody put a windmill up in the city, they could be paid according to when the wind actually blows. Wind typically blows during the night.
But right now, the feed-in tariff doesn't accommodate the differences between wind versus solar because you're taking an average of all renewable energy. Isn't that what the tariff is paying?
No, it's paying based on, if we look at the formula, we're not paying on what it costs to build it. We're paying on what we avoid paying by buying it instead. So if it's wind off-peak, they get the off-peak price. If it's wind on-peak, they get the peak price. If it's solar on-peak, they get the peak price. If it's geothermal, they get the off-peak price during the off-peak hours, the peak price during the peak hours. So the formula is indifferent to which technology is being used.
And my recollection of state law is that it is required to be indifferent to the technology because the legislature has always chosen to be technology agnostic as to which picking winners and losers among solar, wind, geothermal, biomass, biogas, all the other renewable energy sources. So the pricing that's required under SB 1332 necessitates that you must take renewables and you must offer a standard rate that is independent, technology independent. That's my recollection.
I'm not the expert on the statute itself, but I don't think any particular technologies were mentioned in the statute, as I recall.
This particular statute talks about the types of technology that qualify as renewable. That might be in another piece of legislation, but that's entirely possible. That paradigm is in place in state law. Were you talking about maybe the difference between a REC value for different types of renewable energy? Is that what your question
It's such a
is?
thing. Is there a difference between REC values? I mean, if a customer just want to do solar and they think that they should pay a higher price than a wind customer who says that they can run wind cheaper because the investment in wind, I mean, the power could be at night, but it's probably a lower cost investment than solar. So couldn't there be different feed-in tariff for each different technologies, even though the statute doesn't really say that?
Well, the value to GWP of a REC is measured on an annual basis. So it doesn't matter when we're out buying renewable energy. We look for the least expensive supply of renewable energy without respect to whether it's delivered during the peak period or the off-peak period. Because when we get that renewable energy in and get it delivered, we take those RECs and they count according to the rules, whether it's portfolio content category 1, 2, or 3, but they count according to the rules no matter whether the energy came in the middle of the night or whether it came in on the hottest day in August. So from a renewable energy standpoint and a compliance with state regulation standpoint, all the customers are indifferent as to exactly when we buy the energy because all of those RECs count toward compliance.
Right. This sounds like all utilities are buying a portion of solar. So if solar is costing so much, so why is that then? If everything is, all the renewables seem to be equal based on the RECs and the credits that we get. So if it's not equal from a procurement perspective from each utility, couldn't that be applied to the investor as well who's trying to export that energy. Shouldn't they get paid at a higher value if the utilities are paying higher for solar versus wind? But couldn't they get the same amount?
Trying to think of whether we pay more for solar or.
Yeah, on average, all utilities pay a higher cost for solar than other renewables.
Actually, for the new solar projects that are coming in now,
Oh, yeah, the bulk
and the
solar.
new wind projects that are coming in now, I'm trying to take the ones that are not yet built and try to be comparable that way. Wind is more expensive than solar. The large solar arrays out in the desert are
Yeah, it's
coming in
coming
at a
down in
lower
price.
price per megawatt hour than the solar. And then, I'm sorry, than the wind, excuse me. Lower price for the solar than the wind. And also, we have to take into account not just what we pay for the energy at the point where it's generated, but what does it take to actually get it to Glendale or get it to a marketplace where we can sell it. And solar can have some additional costs that wind doesn't have. For example, if the solar is all turning off at the same time and there have to be some other gas-fired plants standing ready to serve, that cost might get passed on to us as a purchaser of solar. So it's not just looking at the prices that were offered at the point where it's generated.
So at this point, you would recommend having separate feed-in tariffs for different technologies?
I
don't think you can either?
No.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, Mr. President, members of the commission. We'll double check, but I think Mr. Hale is exactly right. I don't know. I don't know if it's how it's specifically stated in the statute, but I can tell you in the information I saw, it was the intent not to. It was in the intent to be technology neutral, and not take a stand for any one particular type of technology, but to put together a formula that takes in all of these, and regardless. The only difference being, the cost of the RECs and the components of the formula, peak, off-peak. But that, there isn't. And again, taking into consideration, it doesn't take into consideration the cost of constructing, which is probably the big difference between the different technologies. But we can confirm that. But I believe Mr. Hale is exactly right on that.
It would appear that if we could quantify some added benefit of renewableness to the resource, that you could say that solar is more beneficial in one way or another. But from the perspective of what is more renewable than others, the legislature has a definition of what's renewable, and that's it. That's
agreed. And I think the technology that we're seeing in Glendale is largely solar. I don't see you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's much else out there right now for us as a city in terms of.
Right.
That's correct.
Because I was wondering if we do break that out, solar separately, and because we have citizens who are interested in just solar, what does that feed-in tariff look like if it's just independent of solar? I mean, would that be change or anything for what we have now, or does it actually impact the peak and off-peak pricing? Because now you're just dealing with peak prices.
Well, the solar customer, sorry, the feed-in tariff customer would be paid based on the actual output of the solar array. So to the extent that of course that's tied to the peak period, they would only be paid peak period prices. Whereas a wind developer, if somebody put a wind mill up on top of a building, which is possible, they would get a mix of peak and off-peak prices.
But if you were to change the feed-in tariff just to accommodate for solar and all your distribution losses and all your peak purchasing, and just to offset that peak load, what would that low profile mean? Would it be higher that the solar investors would obtain?
Well, I think this goes back to the question of could we offer a super peak price? And that would certainly benefit a solar developer relative to a wind developer. We could also look at a super peak distributional loss factor, because the losses tend to increase in a nonlinear fashion according to the temperature, the ambient temperature. And so to the extent that solar is on during the hottest time, it's saving even more losses, and that might be another way of adjusting that would benefit specifically solar developers.
Excuse me, Mr. President, members of the Commission, Steve Lenz, Chief AGM for GWP. We're obliged to look at avoided cost, and our avoided cost is bucket one, renewable energy credits, and there's only one value. There's one REC value or one REC market for all of the renewable technologies, so it doesn't matter whether it's solar, wind, geothermal, or any other renewable technology that they come up with in the future. We're obliged under the statute to pay avoided cost. Avoided cost is RECs, and there's only one REC value, one REC market. So it doesn't matter if you're using solar, wind, whatever the technology is, it's not going to impact the price that they're paid under an avoided cost formula.
And that applies to the entire WEC, right? The entire WEC region, Western Energy Coordinating Council.
Well, the statute I'm referring to is the California statute.
Okay, so yeah, I was just wondering where the REC market lies.
Right. But the REC, no, you're right, though. I mean, the RECs are RECs for the entire WEC market.
Right.
Western United States. There's only one renewable energy credit market and one price point for all the technologies.
Well, it sounds like there's some recommendations from a few commissioners on what to look at, so that potentially there could be follow-up on this issue. Because I know that we do update this feed-in tariff every quarter, so maybe there's some future opportunities to revisit that if there's suggestions today on what additional information that maybe we need to look at in the future.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, my objective was to take a look at this after a year of implementation and see what the results of that were. And then, because I had made that overture to Council as well. So we can include a presentation to the Commission before we take it to the Council. And if then at that time we're making any major structural changes to the rate structure, we would present those to you and get your feedback on that to pass along to Council.
So the 1 year mark will be July 1st then, right?
I'm sorry?
The 1 year mark of the feed-in tariff?
1 year mark is July? Is it July?
It's going to be late July.
Right.
So would there be an update before then? Like, we know we have April kind of nothing in there for the agenda. So would you guys have something by then, or do we want to move it to May or June?
It'll probably be something like June. Could be May, but let's put June.
As far as the quarterly pricing that's undertaken now, that's based on a formula that's fixed in the ordinance. So the suggestions you're making, they're good suggestions, but they couldn't be taken into account right now because it's not the way the ordinance is written. But it's certainly something that can and probably should be looked at when this goes back to Council for review.
Any changes at this point, my understanding, Christine, correct me if I'm wrong, are ordinance changes
Yes.
that have to be initiated by the Council, but certainly recommendations by this Commission.
And if I could put a bow on the whole discussion, what I think the objective should be is to shave the super peak, try to reduce that with a range of options. That could include a feed-in tariff adder to sort of quantify the benefit to the entire power system of shaving that super peak. I think we should also include comparison against other contract options for PPAs, for other renewable resources or other resources, including energy efficiency as well. Because that is probably the most cost-effective way for all ratepayers to shave that super peak down.
Well, I concur. So whatever Mr. Commissioner Hale said, I like the energy efficiency component because I think part of the presentation that what additional adders that can be applied. So I think that's a good one.
We'll wait for a report sometime before July. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Peters.
Thank you.
Good discussion. All right, let's move on, please.
4E, Electric Capital Improvement Project.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, Mr. Boyeg is running to the podium to present to you our 5-year electric capital plan. Emphasis on the first 3 years, which is essentially where the bond proceeds that were recently funded will go, and that was the project schedule we included in all of our bond funding information and process. The idea would be under our rate structure that we implemented, our new rate structure, that the outlying 2 years of that 5-year plan would be on a pay-go basis as we have built our reserves and have gotten our operating expenses into a positive mode. Then we can begin to fund our capital through our own means without financing those, at least for those 2 years. So, Ramon?
Yeah, good evening. Ramon Boyeg, Chief AGM. What's in front of you is the same presentation that we made to the City Council as well as to when we did the outreach during our rate case. This is the summary of the 5-year plan that we have, both for the distribution system and as well as for the power management that includes the generation plant. what we've done here, this is the summary page. So what we're looking at here is about $94 million over a course of 5 years. The first 3 years, actually, it extends to the first half of the fourth fiscal year because we got our bond just recently. We're looking at $60 million of bond and about $30 million or so in pay-go. But to clarify this further, what we did was, why are we doing these projects? Okay. So in your sheets, what we have is we identify the things what we need to do that we don't have an option, but it's either mandated because it's a compliance issue or it's a safety issue. And let me clarify, we are considering this as CIP projects, but we do have projects that we do on a regular basis to support the development that's happening, just like what's happening now in downtown Glendale. Okay, so these projects that are customer paid are not being paid for the bond, but these are monies that we put the money up front and collect it once we do it. But going back to the theme, is we try to identify what are the things and what are the benefits for doing this project. For example, Central Avenue, the undergrounding, that's a reliability issue. In this year, we're going to spend about $164,000. Or what that is basically it allows us to connect two substations together to improve the reliability in downtown Glendale and all the development that's happening. And as you're aware, one of the biggest and higher priority project that we have is the Grandview Substation. Okay. That actually is more than just one project. Of the Grandview Substation upgrade, we also need to do the distribution as well as the transmission side so that we can upgrade that area from 4 kV to 12 kV. Then some of the programs that we have that we do on a regular basis, we have what we call the feeder refusing, so that we can coordinate our relays better to minimize the outages, circuit breaker replacement, and so forth. And the next big project that we have is the Acacia Substation. Once we complete the Grandview Substation, we'll be moving on to Acacia. What you see here is we're focusing on the substations that are 4 kV. We're upgrading it to 12 kV. And the purpose of that, too, in addition to reliability, is helps us with our efficiency. The higher the voltage that we have, the less losses that we're paying for. And then on the substation, the generation side, at the Grayson Power Plant, we looked at, as you know, the units are pretty old. And absent the repowering right now, we still have to do projects that are capital. And some of those are either improvements or mandated by OSHA, or we have to meet the safety requirements or reliability requirements. So these are the things that are planned work that needs to be done at the power plant. And again, continuing just with the list, and if you have any questions, by the way, I'll be happy to answer them. But this column here is how we're prioritizing how we're going to do the work. And the bottom line is we don't want to exceed the money that's allowed by the bond. At the same time, we are basically putting some money for pay-go based on the revenue requirements COSA that we just completed. And again, just going through the list of the projects. And kind of went pretty quickly on that because we do have detailed capital improvement projects behind that. We wanted for you just to see where we are and how we're spending the bond monies that we just obtained.
Any questions? Just have a quick one, Mr. Bray. Are we anticipating that we're going to replace Grayson Power Plant, some of the units at Grayson, instead of deferring that to something else?
Yeah, that's not included in this plan, but we are, and Steve can probably talk about it more, but we are doing a study to repower Grayson Power Plant. We have not made that decision at this time yet.
That's in the very preliminary stages, although it is this coming back from our holiday season. Mr. Peters, Mr. Lenz, and myself have already had very detailed discussions, but this is a high priority for us. We're going to push forward with the repower of Grayson. What that's going to look like, I can't quite tell you now because there's a lot of different options that are available to us. But we're going to begin to get some professional assistance on board for the city so that we can start evaluating what those options are, what kind of technology we can put in place, if we have interested partners, potential partners in this endeavor. Will this be a SCAPA-type project? Will this be a City of Glendale solo project, or will it be a City of Glendale-led joint project? Those are all some of the questions we have to explore. But by all means, this is a high priority. It is time for us to take some definitive action in regards to Grayson Power Plant. We firmly believe that we maintain that power plant, that it is in our future and our best interest. It's old, it's tired. You saw a long list of projects up there. Those are really just to keep it limping along. I think we talked a little bit earlier about some of the costs that the city incurs with regards to energy. Solar, wind, and all those, they don't even come close to what it costs us to produce energy at our own power plant because it is so old. So it's time, and we're going to push forward on that. As Ramon indicated, it's not something you see up there. It'll be an extremely expensive endeavor, we imagine, and will be handled separately through whatever means that is, some sort of financing, joint project venture, that kind of thing.
Because I started to notice the cost increase in future years for Grayson, and I wasn't sure that as you see those increases, if you're accounting for making that decision that you're going to repower Grayson. But this cost is getting significant, so I agree that we need to look at that.
It's not getting significant, Mr. Young. It is significant. So, yeah, it's just time. Again, kudos to Steve and his staff. They've done a great job keeping this plant running and keeping it functioning. But when you're dealing with for those of you who have been through there, it has a museum-like quality to it because it is very, very old. It's a great place to visit. Believe me, I love going there. But it certainly takes on more of a industrial museum type quality, and not anything near when you see modern power plants and power generating facilities today. You know, we have a more modern unit sitting on the premises, and you see what a stark difference there is to that. The Magnolia project in Burbank, for instance. So, yeah, this is a big project for us and a huge priority. So we're hitting the ground and running hard on that one. We'll keep you posted on our progress.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Regarding the Mr. Alboy, regarding the prioritization? So I appreciate that you have the prioritization off to the side. In a couple of instances, you have the hydrogen control systems on one slide for Grayson. And then later another project, the hydrogen gas generation system, are more in the out years, and yet it's safety related. So can you just touch on, you're juggling a lot of issues here about reliability, safety in some cases. How did you prioritize what happens when?
I'm going to have to defer to Mr. Lynch on this because that's really this on the power plant.
Mr. President, Commissioner Camargo, we have a betterment plan for the power plant, and we basically have a 5 and 10 year view, and our engineers look at that and prioritize all those projects and put them in order of what they think is the best and highest priority. Between those two, I'd have to go back and get some specific information on why one's prioritized higher than the other.
I think as you undertake any level of project, you have to be concerned. You can't do it all at once, especially when you're talking about a power plant where we have to be very sensitive about what we take out of service and the backup for that while we are working on it. So I think the engineers take that into consideration as well. And again, I just point out that the age of that plant, we probably have a number of high priority issues, probably have several that reach those priority categories of safety or reliability, and we have to go after them in a very systematic way, and we rely on our engineering staff, as Steve said, to lay those out for us. And again, not to belabor the point of the age of the facility, it may be a case of what's closest to going first. And so we need to address that sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to the last item. It's getting late. Next item, please.
4F legislative update.
Then that is young.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, Steve Lins, Chief Assistant General Manager. And this item at this meeting is actually kind of a just-in-case item. At the last Commission meeting, the Commission indicated that if Glendale had a bill that we were going to sponsor, that you'd like to see it before it got through the process. At this point in time, we don't anticipate Glendale actually sponsoring a bill. The industry is looking at sponsoring a bill on a CEQA exemption for 8 miles of recycled water line. That's not in print yet. So I did just want to kind of do a quick pop in. I've put in your packet a printout from our new Sacramento lobbyist. It's a printout of all of the kind of relevant energy and water bills that are in play yesterday, and it's already out of date. As Commissioner Hale knows, we are right in that point of January where the 2-year bills have to be out of their house of origin by the end of this month. New bill introduction have to be completed by the end of next month. So these are changing every day. There's a couple bills of interest. We had a crisis last week where there was a gut and amend of a bill, AB 177, and the new amendments were going to require the Air Resources Board to come up with a 2030 greenhouse gas target. And there's a long list of problems with the bill. The entire California electric utility industry came out in opposition. There was a hearing yesterday at the Assembly Committee on Utilities and Commerce, and it pretty much, they've indicated, the committee indicated that they're going to completely change the bill and take out, we think, all the provisions that we had an issue with. So we'll see what that looks like when we get the print version of the amendments. There's a few bills out there on the water bond, and once again, the state is trying to decide, whether or not we're going to put $11.5 billion bond on the ballot or $6.5 billion, and they're trying to figure out what, the voters of California are going to be willing to stomach. So I'd like you to take some time between now and the next meeting to look through that list. If anything strikes your interest, if you have any questions, please send them to me. Our plan is to bring back our new lobbyist at the next meeting. The actual next scheduled meeting is the first Monday in February, and Mr. Zern and Ramon and I will be up at Sacramento for the CMUA, or California Municipal Utility Association Capital Day. We'll be up there meeting with some of the legislators. So we're going to have to reschedule that meeting, but we'll try to work the logistics and get Emmanuel's Jones here, and they're a very well-known Sacramento lobbyist. They know energy and water issues very well. They are also the utility lobbyist for Burbank and Pasadena. So we will have them back here at the next meeting, depending on logistics. We'll introduce you to them and get a very detailed update. So I guess I would encourage you between now and then, if you really do have anything that you look at in this list that's interesting to you and you have specific questions, get them to me and I'll queue up the lobbyist for the next meeting to get you whatever you need on those.
Just
That's all I have.
Quick point about this process, because I know that this commission is interested in getting an idea of what the staff or the city will propose in terms of positions on these bills. So when the opportunity arises, can we have that discussion as well? Because I'm not sure what the schedule is for these different bills. When would staff or the city make these recommendations on positions?
Yeah, well, as I indicated before, we'll have, at the end of February, you'll kind of know what the landscape looks like in terms of the bills that are in. And then the industry and we, as part of those industry groups, will start forming opinions. And maybe we can have a discussion when the lobbyist is here at the next meeting about how we take positions on those bills. The industry and GWP and the city and the other utilities kind of have a legislative platform. And some of them are, try to maintain local control or, anything that raises our renewable costs, that's unreasonable. Something like that, we try to follow those principles. And as long as they're in line with those principles, we see them as kind of no-brainers. We don't bring them back and air them in front of the commission before we do that. If there's something unique, we might bring it to you or to the council and get some input. But we can have that discussion with the lobbyist and Mr. Zern and staff at the next meeting, and I can see if I can dust off our GWP legislative platform and bring that to the next meeting as well.
Yeah, we had that last time, but I was curious if staff actually goes to City Council for its blessing on the positions as well. Was that the case in the past?
In some cases.
But most of the cases, you follow the
a lot of the
strategic
times, yeah, we will handle that at the staff level, depending on the issue. To be honest with you, I anticipate probably in regards to water issues this year, we may very well be coming to you and to the council and getting your feedback on those, because those are going to be the real hot issues. Water will be hot this year. There's a good chance, if nothing else, to give you a briefing of what the situation is and where we stand in relation to other utilities. As Steve mentioned, through our association in SCAPA and some of our other agencies, a lot of what we do is a joint effort between at least the POUs. And so to the extent that we can get that information to you, we will. If, in fact, there is something we want to take a Glendale-specific stance on, we will try to get that to you.
Yeah, I think we appreciate that, because I think it's something that in the past has been indicated that if some positions might not reflect the community, and if there's Glendale-specific issues, then I think this commission will have to vet that out before it goes to council to get our recommendation at the least.
Yeah, and I think the commitment we made to the best we can, unfortunately with monthly meetings, sometimes this stuff moves pretty fast and changes. It's very dynamic. So to the extent we can, absolutely, we will do that. And as Steve said, we'll talk with the lobbyists and see if there's ways that we can make that happen as well.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Great, thank you, Mr. Lins. All right, next item, please.
5, oral communications.
There's none, so we can close that and move on.
6, agenda forecast.
So, Mr. Yao, members of the commission, first following up on something Steve said, since we're all going to be up north at the CMUA meeting on what was the regularly scheduled date of the commission meeting. We've moved it to that Thursday, the 6th, I believe. 6th. So the February meeting will be on the 6th.
And actually, I suggest that I might not be able to make it, but my prior commitment changed, so I can make it.
Outstanding.
So now we might have a full commission on that meeting.
Outstanding.
February 6th,
February 6th. I think it's a Thursday.
4 p.m.
Great. So what about the agenda items? So
Agenda items at this point look good for that day. I think probably the big issue there is going to be the ability to get a more comprehensive legislative outlook from our lobbyists and ask questions. And also we have on there our RKS survey update, which I believe is on schedule, Mr. Lins. So I think that's going to be a really important issue as well. Strategic planning outlook, I'll give you an update on where we are with that and where we're proceeding. As I had indicated to you before, that was something we really wanted to kick off in the new year. We spent some time amongst top management staff prior to the holiday season kind of setting the basis for it. And then it was a crowd. We have a crowd in here. And then we have our KPI. As you recall, that's something that we bring to you. It's a quarterly update that we do at the council, and then we'll show you that what our key performance indicators are and what our progress is. So I anticipate that agenda will stay pretty solid, as will March. And I hesitate only because you see we have a blank slate on April, but you may recall I indicated May meeting is when we had hoped to come back to you with the revised rate structure and what we were going to be essentially taking to council and getting your recommendations on that. I think my recommendation would be to the extent we can move most of what's currently in May up to April and fill that slot and leave us pretty much the whole meeting to talk about the revised rate structure. I imagine you will probably have a few more visitors that particular afternoon than we have on a regular basis, and you'll probably have a lot of questions, and we'll have staff from not just GWP but the various departments to answer questions, and along we'll have our consultant, I would imagine, too. So we probably will just go ahead unless you have other thoughts, and just move May into April and set the May meeting aside for the water rate structure presentation and discussion.
That sounds like a good plan. And actually, as I recall from the last water rate discussion, we actually had a few special meetings because we needed 2 hours at least to talk about the different details of the tier structures and that stuff. So potentially, if the need arises, we can actually schedule special meetings in between.
We could keep in mind, though, as we've indicated, this is a really tight schedule because we essentially have to make decisions to stop what's occurring now, and that's a continued loss of revenue. So to the extent that within the schedule, and we'll have something for you, but I have to tell you it's pretty tight. We want to be to council probably the week following the commission meeting. So we're hoping, that's all the more reason, I think, to set the whole day or the whole meeting agenda aside for that particular issue and see if we can get it all vetted out. If there is further follow-up questions, we will do the best we can to try to adjust the schedule. But we really, in all sincerity, want to keep it as close to what we have now so that we can get that decision made as quickly as possible.
And did you mention earlier that you thought we could get a view of the cost of service analysis in March?
I'm going to certainly try
April?
to do that, and that's probably when it would fit in about the March meeting, but I'm going to go back and see where we are status-wise, and if that works, I will definitely follow up on that, Mr. Cormego.
And then we also talked about the Neodra study in March as well.
Correct.
Yeah, so can we add the West Side Stream results of the study to the March agenda?
Yeah, we'll add that. We'll see tentatively if we can get at least the first blush look at the COSA to the commission. Probably what we'll do, since we're moving May up to April, we've got that energy risk management update. We can probably take it out of March to free up some space there for the two new items. We'll cover the energy risk management in April. And then I think that was all of the additional meetings we wanted to talk about. Or additional items, excuse me.
I think in February, I'd like to have a discussion about the drought and what a statewide drought declaration means, and maybe discuss a menu of conservation options that we can start to explore and make recommendations to City Council, because I think getting ahead of the governor's declaration would probably be a good idea, and this is shaping up to be a really bad water year.
Yeah. That's a very good point. What we'll do is, for your reading pleasure, we will send to you what our existing conservation ordinance looks like. Whether that's going to be effective in what we have coming, it's certainly, I think, a good starting point. We've already, in my discussions with staff, have begun to put together the outreach campaign. So starting to let people know now about the condition we're in and to begin to conserve water. This would be all on a voluntary basis. And then we're anticipating the declaration comes from Sacramento on the 1st of February, so the timing is good. And then, but as I said ahead of time, I'll get you what our existing ordinance looks like, and that'll give you a kind of a primer for where we're at, and then make suggestions and recommendations on either additions or changes to that.
So even if the declaration doesn't come out by the 6th, if it's too soon, we can still have a water conservation agenda item so that we can let the public know.
Absolutely.
Right?
I just indicated that the timing might be right so that the actual declaration is out, but we'll put it on the agenda regardless. We're in a drought.
Yeah, I would actually encourage that, because we may want to take options even if there isn't a drought declaration. We may want to start, suggesting some conservation measures for fall.
Absolutely. And certain agencies in the state have already done that. They've already implemented, in effect, their conservation ordinances in anticipation of it. And even if there isn't a declaration, and I can't believe that there won't be, we need to take some level of measure. Many of you may have read recently some of the weather phenomenons that are occurring that may be causing this. They don't have any idea when that might go away. They're talking about 76, 77 type conditions, which were the driest in the 20th century. And we may top those. So, yeah, Mr. Hale's absolutely right. It's a very serious issue. We'll have it on the agenda and discuss it.
So we'll put down water conservation as an agenda item, or water conservation procedure, or drought, whatever, how we want to call the agenda item.
Yeah, we can call it drought preparation /water conservation. I mean, water conservation is something we promote all the time, but in relation to a drought, specifically to a drought seasons.
Yeah, and I think a conversation about MWD rates, water supply issues, where our water is coming from, what are the upstream sources of the water, what are the status of those reservoirs. The San Luis Reservoir is at 33% when it should be upwards of 80, 90%.
Yes.
I mean, these are huge issues that we should consider. So.
Yes. Mr. Boyd will be attending an MWD meeting this Friday, so he will be able to provide us some more update on that as well.
Great. Does anything else?
Yeah, just real quick. So we had the pretty detailed report on the electric reliability report today with Sadie, Safety, et cetera. So what is the thought to revisiting that? Is it on an annual basis, and/or are some of those measures just baked into the KPIs, and we'll get that through the KPI updates?
I think we've got a couple of the related issues in the KPIs. You'll see them there. But I think to see some, unless Ramon thinks more frequently, I think annual basis report would be a good one, especially now that we've got our CIP program cranked back up again, and we begin to put some of these projects in place. Some of those conversion projects we have are greatly going to help as well. And what you didn't see up there, and a point I needed to make, is our modernization efforts in the original Department of Energy grant that we had. That is something that we are finalizing. We were close to finishing up what our initial obligation was. We've gotten an extension to spring of 2015. We fully expect to meet all of our obligations by then. So some of those efforts, as well as I had indicated earlier, are going to go towards reliability. But I think to give this enough time to make it worth, to add value to it for you, is if we schedule it as an annual update.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else?
A few months back, we actually had a conversation about having a outlook on this long-term strategic plan or your integrated resource planning, and I don't think we've had that conversation. So I don't know if that's something that I don't know what the status of that planning is, and maybe it would be helpful to have an update.
We have that for the February meeting where we call it Outlook, which is my update to you on where we're at with that. It's primarily where we're going with our strategic plan, as I indicated. We wanted to get that going in earnest after the first of the year.
Okay.
And then into the regard of any IRP work we're doing, we can fold that into as well.
All right, anything else? Great, so let's move on to the last item.
7, adjournment.
The motion to adjourn?
I'll second it.
Wait.
I was doing it.
I was hoping
somebody else would.
Let's go. Well, meeting adjourned. Thank you.